Lonely, 75-year-old man finds dying kitten. After Sandstorm, it becomes his world until the silence was the first thing you noticed. Not an empty silence, but one thick with unseen life, with the patient endurance of the Arizona desert. Richard, 75 years old and shaped by a lifetime of precise calculations and tangible constructions, had come to appreciate its subtle language. He lived alone in a small, sturdy house built of adobe and weathered wood, perched on the edge of nowhere, where the saguaros stood like ancient sentinels and the horizon stretched into infinity, a canvas painted daily by the rising and setting sun. He'd been an engineer, a builder of bridges and structures designed to defy time and stress. Retirement, arriving abruptly after a corporate merger, deemed his experience redundant, had initially felt like a foundation crumbling beneath him. His wife, Eleanor, had already been gone 5 years by then, claimed by the quiet thief that was cancer, leaving a void that echoed louder than any collapsing structure. Their children, grown and scattered across the country, one in bustling New York, the other navigating the damp chill of Seattle, were loving in their way, but distant, caught in the currents of their own lives. So Richard had sought stillness, a place where the ache of absence might be absorbed by the vast, unjudging landscape. He sold the suburban house filled with ghosts and memories, packed his few essentials, and drove southwest until the noise faded, settling here, where the days unfolded with quiet predictability. His mornings began before dawn, the ritual of coffee, a comforting anchor. He'd sit on the covered porch, a simple wooden chair creaking softly under his weight, and watch the sky bleed from inky black to bruised purple, then fiery orange, and finally impossible blue. He'd note the subtle shifts in light, the way the shadows retreated across the sand, the scurry of a roadrunner, the silent glide of a hawk overhead. These were the small, essential details of his solitary existence. He read books, mostly nonfiction histories, biographies, science journals. He tinkered in his small workshop, fixing things that weren't broken, sometimes sketching designs for projects he'd never built, the habit of creation ingrained too deeply to abandon entirely. Loneliness was a constant companion, sometimes a dull ache, sometimes a sharp pang, triggered by a memory. Eleanor's laugh, the way she arranged wildflowers in a jar, the chaotic joy of family holidays long past. He'd learned to live with it, acknowledging its presence like the heat shimmer on the horizon, a persistent, undeniable part of the landscape of his later years. He wasn't unhappy, not exactly. Resigned, perhaps. Content in the quiet routine, finding a measure of peace in the solitude he had chosen, yet always aware of the silence within the silence. That particular afternoon, the familiar stillness began to fray. The air grew heavy, charged with an electric tension. The sky, usually a vast expanse of clear blue, started to curdle, turning a strange, bruised yellow-gray toward the west. Richard, standing by the window, felt the hairs on his arms prickle. He knew the signs. He'd lived here long enough to recognize the desert's moods. The wind began to pick up. Not the usual gentle breeze, but sharp, erratic gusts that whipped sand against the glass like tiny, insistent pellets. "Sandstorm," he murmured, his voice raspy from disuse. He moved with the unhurried efficiency of age, checking the latches on the windows, ensuring the door was sealed tight. The sky darkened rapidly now, the sun obscured by a roiling wall of ochre dust advancing across the desert floor like a malevolent entity. The wind began to howl, a high-pitched, keening sound that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the house. Dust, fine as talcum powder, found its way through invisible cracks, coating surfaces in a gritty film, the smell of dry earth filling the air. Richard sat in his worn armchair, the familiar creak drowned out by the storm's fury. He wasn't frightened. He respected the desert's power. He simply waited, listening to the roar, the percussive rattle of sand against the walls and roof. It was a reminder of nature's indifference, its raw, untamed force, a stark contrast to the controlled, predictable world he had once built his life around. The storm raged for what felt like hours, a relentless assault that blotted out the world beyond his small refuge. Then, as suddenly as it began, the worst of it passed. The howling wind subsided into mournful sighs. The dense curtain of dust began to thin, though the air remained thick and hazy. A strange, subdued light filtered through the windows. Richard waited a while longer, letting the dust settle further, the silence slowly reasserting itself, albeit muffled and changed. Finally, he pushed himself up from the chair, his joints protesting slightly. He opened the front door cautiously, peering out into the transformed landscape. Everything was coated in a fine layer of reddish dust. The air was still gritty, catching in his throat. The familiar shapes of cacti and rocks seemed softened, blurred, as if viewed through a gauze filter. The world felt muted, subdued, and then he heard it, faint, almost lost in the settling quiet, but unmistakable. A tiny, high-pitched sound, thin and reedy. A cry. It sounded weak, distressed, almost swallowed by the vastness. Richard frowned, straining his ears. It came again, a little stronger this time, trembling and desperate. It seemed to be coming from the direction of a cluster of boulders near the edge of his small, cleared yard, where the desert scrub began reclaiming the land. Curiosity piqued, mingled with a flicker of concern. He stepped out onto the porch, pulling his worn cardigan tighter around him against the lingering chill in the dusty air. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning the ground, following the intermittent mews. There, huddled in the narrow space between two sun-baked rocks, was a small, miserable-looking creature. A kitten. It was coated head to tail in fine reddish dust, making its original color almost indiscernible, though hints of ginger peeked through. It was curled into a tight ball, shivering despite the ambient warmth. Its fur was ragged, matted with grime, and Richard could see angry red scratches on its tiny front paws, likely from tumbling through the harsh desert scrub during the storm. Its eyes, when they flickered open, were huge in its small face, almond-shaped, a startling green gold, but clouded with exhaustion and fear. They fixed on Richard, wide and unblinking. The kitten let out another pitiful cry, weaker this time, a sound that tugged at something deep within Richard's carefully guarded solitude. Where had it come from? There were no near neighbors. Perhaps a feral cat colony miles away? Or maybe, improbably, it had been traveling with someone, somehow got lost, and then swept up by the terrifying force of the storm. Its past was a mystery written in dust and fear. Richard approached slowly, cautiously, not wanting to frighten it further. He crouched down, his knees creaking in protest. "Hey there, little fellow," he said softly, his voice gentle. "You look like you've had a rough time." The kitten flinched at the sound, but didn't move. It seemed utterly spent, too weak to even attempt escape. It just watched him, trembling. He extended a hand slowly, palm up, fingers slightly curled. He remembered Eleanor doing this with strays, a gesture of peace. The kitten blinked, its tiny nose twitching as it caught his scent. It didn't hiss, didn't recoil. It just watched, its gaze unwavering, filled with a primal terror, mixed with utter helplessness. "It's okay," Richard murmured. "I won't hurt you." His fingers, weathered and marked by years of work and sun, gently touched the dusty fur on the kitten's head. It was surprisingly soft beneath the grime. The kitten shivered violently at the contact, but didn't pull away. It let out a tiny, almost inaudible squeak. Carefully, mindful of its fragile state, Richard slid his hands underneath the small, trembling body. It weighed almost nothing. He lifted the kitten, cradling it against his chest. It felt bony, fragile, a tiny spark of life against his solid frame. It stiffened for a moment, then, perhaps, sensing the warmth and the steady beat of his heart, it seemed to relax ever so slightly, burying its dusty face into the fabric of his cardigan. Holding the small bundle carefully, Richard straightened up and walked back toward the house. The silence of the desert seemed different now, less empty. As he stepped back inside, closing the door against the hazy, dust-filled world, he looked down at the creature in his arms. Its eyes were closed now, its breathing shallow but regular. He carried it into the bathroom, setting it gently on a soft old towel on the closed toilet lid while he ran some warm water in the sink. He found a soft washcloth and dampened it. Cleaning the kitten was a slow, painstaking process. He worked gently, wiping away the layers of dust and grime, revealing patches of bright ginger fur beneath. He saw how thin it was, its ribs faintly visible. The scratches on its paws looked sore, but not deeply infected. He cleaned them as best he could. The kitten endured the bath with surprising passivity, too exhausted to struggle, occasionally letting out a soft mewl. When he was done, he wrapped it in a clean, dry towel, rubbing it gently. The fur began to fluff up slightly as it dried, revealing a classic tabby pattern mixed with the ginger. He found an old saucer and filled it with fresh water, holding it near the kitten's nose. After a moment's hesitation, a tiny pink tongue darted out, lapping tentatively, then more eagerly. Richard felt a small surge of relief. It was drinking. He didn't have any cat food, hadn't needed any in decades, but he remembered Eleanor sometimes giving strays a little milk. He poured a small amount into another saucer. The kitten sniffed it, then began to lap, its whole body focused on the small nourishment. Once it had drunk its fill, its eyelids began to droop heavily. Richard carefully lifted the towel-wrapped bundle and carried it into the living room. He cleared a space on the old, comfortable sofa, laying down another soft towel. He placed the kitten on it. It immediately curled into a tight ball, tucking its nose under its scratched paws, and seemed to fall instantly into a deep, exhausted sleep. Richard stood there for a long moment, looking down at the small, sleeping creature. The house felt different. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was punctuated by the soft, rhythmic breathing of the kitten. He pulled up a nearby footstool and sat down, watching it sleep. He hadn't planned this. He hadn't sought out companionship. He had built walls of routine and solitude around his heart, protecting himself from further loss. But the storm had brought something unexpected, something small and fragile and utterly dependent. He looked at the dust settling on his windowsill, remembering the chaos outside just a short time ago. Came in with the dust, he murmured to himself. Dusty. That seems right. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether the kitten would survive, whether it belonged to someone who might come looking for it. But for now, curled up on his sofa, it was safe. And Richard, watching over it, felt a flicker of something unfamiliar stir within him, a warmth spreading through the quiet landscape of his heart. For the first time in a long time, the silence felt a little less lonely. The storm had passed, leaving behind an unexpected, fragile gift. Days bled into weeks, marked by the rhythm of the desert sun and the growing presence of the small ginger cat. Dusty, as Richard now invariably called him, proved to be a resilient creature. The initial days were spent mostly sleeping, eating small, frequent meals. Richard made trips to the nearest town, a dusty hour's drive away, stocking up on kitten food, a litter box, and a few simple toys, and slowly regaining his strength. The scratches on his paws healed, leaving tiny pink scars hidden beneath his fur. His coat, diligently brushed by Richard, lost its ragged look and began to shine with the vibrant health of a desert sunset. Richard found himself adapting his long-established routines to accommodate his new companion. His solitary morning coffee on the porch now included Dusty, who would sit perched on the railing, blinking owlishly in the early light, occasionally batting at a curious insect. Richard's reading time in the armchair was now shared. Dusty would leap silently onto the adjacent cushion, curl up, and purr, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the quiet room, a soothing counterpoint to the turning of pages. He talked to the cat, initially feeling foolish, but soon finding it natural. He narrated his day, commented on the book he was reading, shared observations about the weather. Dusty would listen, or seem to listen, tilting his head, his green-gold eyes fixed on Richard's face, occasionally offering a soft meow in response, as if understanding the nuances of human loneliness. "Eleanor would have liked you," Richard found himself saying one afternoon, stroking Dusty's soft fur as the cat lay sprawled bonelessly across his lap. The name hung in the air, heavy with memory. He rarely spoke it aloud anymore. Eleanor, his vibrant, life-loving wife. She had been the one who filled their previous house with warmth, laughter, and a menagerie of rescued creatures, birds with broken wings, stray dogs, and yes, several cats. She had a boundless capacity for nurturing that Richard, with his engineer's practicality, had always admired but felt incapable of replicating. He looked around his spare, tidy living room. It was clean, functional, but lacked her touch, the colorful throws, the photos crowding the mantelpiece, the general sense of comfortable clutter that signifies a life fully lived. His life now was pared down, simplified like the desert landscape outside. Functional, enduring, but stark. Dusty stretched, yawned, and kneaded Richard's thigh with his paws. Claws carefully retracted, a sign of contentment Richard had learned to recognize. He smiled faintly. "She spoiled all her cats rotten, you know. You'd have had her wrapped around your little paw in no time." He fell silent, lost in thought. He remembered Eleanor in her garden, coaxing roses to bloom in their suburban yard, her hands covered in earth. She'd battled the clay soil with the same gentle persistence she'd used to battle her illness. She had lost the latter fight, but the roses had bloomed spectacularly the spring after she was gone, a final, beautiful defiance. Here, in the desert, Richard tended only a few hardy cacti, plants that asked for little and endured much, like himself. His workshop, too, saw a change. Dusty would follow him there, navigating the space filled with tools, old blueprints, and half-finished projects with surprising agility. He'd settle on a dusty workbench, out of the way but always watchful, occasionally batting playfully at a dangling wire or a measuring tape, providing a small living distraction from Richard's focused tinkering. Richard found himself working on a new project, a small multi-level cat tree, constructed with the same precision he'd once devoted to bridge supports. He measured, cut, and assembled the carpet-covered platforms, sanding the edges smooth, ensuring its stability. Dusty inspected the work in progress with grave curiosity, rubbing his scent on the posts as if claiming ownership before it was even finished. The companionship was a balm, soothing the raw edges of Richard's solitude, but it also, paradoxically, sharpened his awareness of his own age and fragility. One morning, reaching for the coffee grinder on a high shelf, a wave of dizziness washed over him. The room tilted, gray spots dancing before his eyes. He gripped the counter, breathing deeply until the sensation passed, leaving him shaky and unnerved. It wasn't the first time, but these episodes seemed to be growing slightly more frequent. He dismissed it as simply getting older, the natural wear and tear on the machinery of the body. Dusty, who had been weaving around his ankles, seemed to sense the shift. He stopped, sat down, and looked up at Richard, letting out a soft, questioning meow. Richard reached down and scratched the cat behind the ears. "Just a bit wobbly, Dusty. Happens when you get to be an old relic like me." But the incident lingered in his mind. What if he fell? What if something more serious happened? He lived miles from the nearest neighbor, further still from town. Who would know? Who would care for Dusty? The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the morning air. His carefully constructed independence suddenly felt less like strength and more like precarious isolation. His children called infrequently. Mark, the lawyer in New York, was always busy, his calls filled with rushed updates about cases and city life. Sarah, the graphic designer in Seattle, seemed gentler, more attuned to his potential loneliness, but her own life with her partner and their demanding jobs kept her occupied. He told them about Dusty during one of Sarah's calls. "A cat? Dad, that's nice," she'd said, a note of surprise in her voice. "Are you sure you're up for that? At your age?" The question, though likely well-intentioned, stung. "I'm perfectly capable, Sarah," he'd replied, a touch defensively. "He's good company." Okay, just be careful. Does he ever get out? It's pretty wild out there." "He stays close," Richard had assured her, though the recent dizzy spell made him wonder if he was the one who needed to be careful. He didn't mention the dizziness. He never mentioned the growing stiffness in his joints, the way stairs sometimes felt like mountains, the subtle anxieties that crept in during the long, quiet nights. He didn't want them to worry, didn't want to become a burden. His pride, coupled with a reluctance to disrupt their busy lives, kept him silent about the small erosions of age. Dusty, oblivious to these anxieties, thrived. He grew from a scrawny kitten into a sleek, muscular young cat. His ginger fur deepened in color, his tabby stripes bold and distinct. He developed a personality curious, playful, but also deeply affectionate towards Richard. He had a habit of bringing Richard gifts, usually hapless lizards or large, unfortunate beetles left proudly on the porch mat. Richard would dispose of them with a sigh, careful not to offend the mighty hunter. One evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery hues, Richard sat on the porch with Dusty settled comfortably on the armrest of his chair. The silence felt companionable now, not empty. He reflected on the improbable turn his life had taken. He, the logical engineer, the solitary retiree, had found his quiet existence irrevocably altered by a small creature brought in by a storm. Dusty wasn't a replacement for Eleanor or for the family life he once had. He was something different, a present-tense companion, grounding Richard in the here and now. His presence filled the small house, not with noise, but with life. His dependence gave Richard a renewed sense of purpose, however small. Caring for Dusty, providing food, water, shelter, affection, was a tangible act, a simple responsibility that anchored him. But the comfort Dusty brought was laced with a new kind of vulnerability. Richard found himself worrying about the cat's safety constantly. He scanned the yard for predators, coyotes, hawks, before letting Dusty out for supervised exploration. Every distant yelp or screech in the night made him tense. He had let something into his carefully guarded heart, and with it came the inevitable fear of loss. He had lost so much already. The thought of losing this small, warm creature was almost unbearable. He looked down at Dusty, who was purring contentedly, occasionally twitching his tail as he watched a moth flutter near the porch light. Richard reached out and gently stroked the cat's back. Dusty arched into the touch, his purr intensifying. "Quite a pair, aren't we?" Richard murmured. "An old man and a desert cat." The bond between them was woven from quiet moments, shared routines, and unspoken understanding. It was a simple, profound connection forged in the aftermath of a storm, an unexpected flowering of affection in the arid landscape of Richard's later years. It made the days brighter, the silence warmer, but it also cast long shadows, reminding Richard of the fragility of connection, the preciousness of time, and the ever-present possibility of another storm on the horizon. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm, the man and the cat orbiting each other in the quiet solitude of the desert house. Dusty, now fully grown, had mapped the boundaries of his small kingdom, the house, the porch, the cleared area around it, and a specific large boulder under which he liked to nap during the heat of the day. Richard trusted him not to wander too far. Dusty seemed content with his domain and rarely ventured out of sight. The summer heat intensified, baking the landscape under a relentless sun. Richard spent more time indoors, the air conditioner humming steadily. Dusty would sprawl on the cool tile floor, conserving energy, occasionally rousing himself to follow Richard from room to room. The bond between them had deepened into a quiet, unwavering companionship. Dusty seemed attuned to Richard's moods, rubbing against his legs when he seemed lost in thought, settling nearby with a comforting purr when the silence felt too heavy. One late afternoon, as the heat began to relent slightly, Richard decided to do some light work in his shed. He left the back door slightly ajar as he often did, allowing Dusty to come and go into the fenced backyard area. Dusty was dozing in a patch of shade on the porch when Richard went out, engrossed in organizing a box of old bolts and screws, a task that satisfied his innate need for order. The familiar scent of oil and dust filled the small space. Time slipped away, measured only by the lengthening shadows outside. He was sorting washers by size when a faint, distant sound pricked his awareness, the sharp yelp of a coyote. It wasn't unusual to hear them, especially as dusk approached, but this one sounded closer than normal. A sudden, sharp anxiety gripped Richard. Dusty. He dropped the washers, their metallic clatter loud in the sudden silence. He hurried out of the shed, his heart pounding with a sudden, sickening dread. "Dusty?" he called out, his voice tight. "Dusty!" He scanned the yard, his eyes darting toward the boulder, the porch, the familiar napping spots. Nothing. The back door was still ajar as he'd left it. "Dusty!" he called again, louder this time, fear making his voice tremble slightly. Silence. Only the buzz of cicadas and the distant mocking echo of the coyote answered him. Panic began to set in, cold and sharp. Dusty never missed the sound of his voice. He always came running, or at least answered with a meow. Richard walked quickly around the house, checking every window, every possible hiding spot. He looked under the sparse bushes, behind the water tank, his calls becoming more frantic. "Dusty, come on, boy. Where are you?" The sun was dipping lower, painting the western sky in dramatic strokes of orange and purple, but the beauty was lost on Richard. Shadows deepened, turning familiar shapes into uncertain forms. The desert, usually a place of quiet solace, suddenly felt vast, menacing, full of hidden dangers. Coyotes, snakes, hawks. Dusty was a capable cat, but he was still small, domesticated. Richard grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, his hand shaking slightly. He had to find him before darkness fell completely. He started systematically searching the perimeter of his property, his beam cutting through the gathering dusk, calling Dusty's name over and over until his throat felt raw. He pushed through brittle scrub, ignoring the branches that scratched at his arms and snagged his clothes. He peered into rocky crevices under creosote bushes, his hope dwindling with the fading light. The dizziness he occasionally felt seemed to hover at the edge of his perception, a faint swimming sensation exacerbated by panic and exertion. He forced it down, focusing entirely on the search. How could he have been so careless, leaving the door ajar? He'd become complacent, lulled by the routine, by Dusty's apparent contentment. The image of the small, dusty kitten he'd found after the storm flashed in his mind, so fragile, so vulnerable. Had he brought him here only to lose him to the desert's harshness? An hour passed, then another. Darkness was complete now, the sky a sweep of brilliant stars, utterly indifferent. Richard leaned against a saguaro, breathing heavily, sweat cooling unpleasantly on his skin. Despair washed over him. Dusty was gone, lost, or worse. The silence of the desert pressed in, amplifying his sense of failure, his crushing loneliness. The companionship he had cherished, the small life that had brought warmth back into his solitary existence, had vanished into the vast, uncaring night. He thought of Eleanor again, the terrible finality of her absence. This felt different, yet horribly familiar, the sudden, gut-wrenching void left by something precious being taken away. He forced himself to move again, making one more slow circle around the house, his flashlight beam weaker now, his calls hoarse and pleading. "Dusty, please!" As he rounded the corner towards the front porch, his beam caught something, a flicker of movement near the steps. His heart leaped. He swung the light back, holding his breath. There, huddled on the bottom step, looking small and subdued, was Dusty. Dusty! Relief washed over Richard so intensely it made him weak at the knees. He stumbled forward, dropping the flashlight, and sank down onto the step beside the cat. Dusty looked up at him and let out a small, plaintive meow. He wasn't dusty or injured, but he seemed shaken. His fur was slightly ruffled, and he pressed himself close against Richard's leg, trembling faintly. "Oh, Dusty," Richard choked out, scooping the cat into his arms. Dusty didn't resist, burying his face in Richard's shirt just as he had that first day. Richard held him tight, feeling the small, warm body, the frantic beat of his own heart slowly subsiding. "Where were you? I was so worried, so worried." He carried Dusty inside, closing and locking the door firmly behind him. He checked him over carefully, finding no injuries, no scratches, just a slight tremor running through his body. Perhaps the coyote had come too close, giving him a fright, sending him into hiding until the danger passed. Richard sat in his armchair, holding Dusty close, stroking him until the trembling stopped and the familiar purr started, low and uneven at first, then growing stronger. He didn't let him go for a long time, needing the physical reassurance of the cat's presence. The incident left a mark. The carefree ease of their companionship was subtly altered, shadowed by the sharp reminder of potential loss. Richard became more cautious, double-checking doors and windows, keeping a closer eye on Dusty whenever he was outside. The desert landscape, once a source of peace, now seemed to hold its breath, its beauty tinged with a latent threat. The scare also forced Richard to confront his own vulnerabilities more directly. The panic, the physical exertion of the search, the brief spell of dizziness, it all underscored his age, his isolation. What if he hadn't found Dusty? What if something happened to him? A few days later, sorting through a box of old papers, he came across a faded photograph. It showed a much younger Richard, standing beside Eleanor, both smiling, their arms around two young children, Mark and Sarah, perhaps 6 and 4 years old. They were standing in front of the frame of a house under construction, Richard's first big solo project, after starting his own small firm. He remembered the pride, the optimism, the feeling that he was building not just a structure, but a future, a legacy. He looked at the photo for a long time, tracing the lines of Eleanor's smiling face. Where had all that time gone? The children were adults with complex lives far away. Eleanor was a cherished memory. The firm had been swallowed by a larger corporation. The legacy felt intangible now. What remained was him, an old man in a small house in the desert. His most profound connection, a cat, brought in by the wind. Was this enough? He looked over at Dusty, who was watching him intently from the sofa. The cat blinked slowly, a gesture Richard had come to interpret as affection. He felt a familiar warmth spread through his chest. Maybe legacy wasn't about bridges built or companies founded. Maybe it was about the connections forged, the care given, the small acts of kindness. Maybe it was about finding warmth in the twilight, even if it came in the unexpected form of a stray cat. But the fear lingered. The search in the dark had stirred up anxieties he usually kept at bay. The fragility of it all. Dusty's life, his own life, the thin thread of their companionship in the vast indifference of the desert felt starkly apparent. He held Dusty closer that night, listening to his purr, finding solace in the simple, living presence, yet haunted by the shadows the search had illuminated. The quiet rhythm of their life had returned, but beneath it ran a new undercurrent of vigilance, a heightened awareness of the precious, precarious nature of the bond they shared. The years that followed the scare unfolded with the quiet rhythm Richard had come to cherish, yet subtly underscored by a heightened awareness of time's passage. Richard grew older, his steps slower, the stiffness in his joints a more constant companion. The dizzy spells hadn't worsened significantly, but they served as periodic reminders of his body's inevitable decline. Dusty, too, transitioned from a vigorous young adult into a mature, then senior cat. His bursts of playful energy became less frequent, replaced by longer naps in sunbeams or curled contentedly on Richard's lap. His ginger coat, once vibrant, was now flecked with distinguished white hairs around his muzzle. Their bond deepened into a profound symbiotic companionship. They were two aging souls navigating the quiet landscape of their lives together. Dusty seemed to sense Richard's limitations, staying closer, rarely venturing far from the house, even when the door was open. He developed an uncanny ability to appear just when Richard felt a pang of loneliness or a moment of physical weakness, rubbing against his legs or jumping onto his lap with a soft purr, a warm, living anchor. Richard's conversations with Dusty continued, evolving from simple narration into deeper reflections. He spoke of Eleanor, not with sharp grief anymore, but with a gentle nostalgia, sharing memories as if introducing his late wife to his feline friend. He talked about his regrets, the times he'd prioritized work over family, the distances that had grown between him and his children. "You get caught up in building things, Dusty," he confided one evening, watching the sunset paint the desert sky while Dusty dozed on the porch railing. "You think you're building something permanent, something strong, but life isn't like steel and concrete. It's fragile. People drift apart. Time wears everything down." He sighed, stroking Dusty's back. Should have called Sarah more often. Should have visited Mark. But it's hard, bridging those distances. Dusty flicked an ear, perhaps acknowledging the sentiment, perhaps just reacting to a passing fly. One winter, Richard caught a bad flu. It settled deep in his chest, leaving him weak, feverish, and confined to bed for nearly a week. It was the most ill he'd been since moving to the desert. The isolation felt acute then. He managed to call Sarah, downplaying his symptoms, assuring her he was fine, just needed rest. But the effort of getting up to feed Dusty, to refill his water bowl, left him breathless and trembling. During those difficult days, Dusty rarely left his side. He curled up on the foot of the bed, a silent, watchful presence. When Richard coughed, Dusty would lift his head, blinking slowly. When Richard finally managed to get up, Dusty would follow him, staying close as if offering silent support. Richard, weak and vulnerable, found immense comfort in the cat's unwavering loyalty. He wasn't entirely alone. As Richard slowly recovered, he realized how much he relied on Dusty, not just for companionship, but as a vital link to life, a reason to get up, to keep going. The thought of what would happen to Dusty if he, Richard, were gone became a persistent worry. He made arrangements, writing detailed instructions for Dusty's care, including contact information for a no-kill animal sanctuary in the nearest city, and setting aside funds specifically for the cat's future well-being. He placed the instructions with his will, a pragmatic acknowledgement of his own mortality. Around the time Richard turned 82, he noticed Dusty slowing down more markedly. The cat slept more, ate a little less, and sometimes seemed hesitant before jumping onto the sofa or Richard's lap. His eyesight wasn't as sharp. He occasionally bumped into furniture he used to navigate with ease. Richard took him to the vet in town, a quiet, kind woman who had treated Dusty since his arrival. The diagnosis was predictable: arthritis, common in older cats, and the beginnings of kidney issues, also frequent. There was no cure, only management, special food, medication to ease the joint pain. Richard accepted the news with a quiet sadness. He administered Dusty's medicine faithfully, switched his food, and made accommodations, placing ramps near the sofa and bed so Dusty wouldn't have to jump. He carried him more often, holding the cat's aging body, now lighter and more fragile, feeling the delicate bones beneath the thinning fur. Their roles had subtly reversed. Now it was Richard who was the primary caregiver, tending to Dusty's needs with gentle patience. He cherished every purr, every slow blink, every moment Dusty curled up beside him. He knew their time together was finite, borrowed time granted after a storm years ago. One morning, Richard woke to find Dusty not in his usual spot at the foot of the bed. A familiar pang of anxiety, reminiscent of the night Dusty went missing, tightened his chest. He sat up, calling softly, "Dusty?" He found him lying on the cool tile floor near the doorway, curled in a patch of early morning sun. He looked peaceful, as if asleep. But when Richard reached down to touch him, the fur felt cool. Dusty didn't stir. His breathing, usually a soft, rhythmic presence in the quiet house, was absent. Richard sank to his knees beside his companion. There were no signs of struggle, no distress. He had simply slipped away in his sleep, quietly and peacefully. Richard gently stroked the soft fur, the ginger now muted with age. Tears welled in his eyes, blurring the image of the loyal friend who had shared the last decade of his life. He sat there for a long time, the silence of the house pressing in, no longer companionable, but vast and achingly empty. The grief was profound, a deep, tearing sorrow that echoed the loss of Eleanor, yet was uniquely tied to this small creature who had demanded so little and given so much. He thought of the dusty, frightened kitten he'd found between the rocks, the shared routines, the quiet comfort, the scare in the dark, the unwavering presence during his illness. Dusty had been more than a pet. He had been a confidant, a companion, a furry anchor in the solitary sea of old age. With slow, deliberate movements, driven by the engineer's need for order even in grief, Richard wrapped Dusty gently in his favorite soft towel. He took a shovel from the shed, his hands trembling slightly, not just from age, but from sorrow. He chose a spot near the porch, under the shade of a hardy mesquite tree where Dusty had often liked to sit and watch the lizards. Digging the small grave was hard work, his body protesting, but he pushed through, needing this final act of care. The desert soil was hard-packed, resistant. As he dug, he remembered Dusty's arrival, a tiny creature brought by the wind and dust. Now he was returning him to the earth, to the desert that had, in its own harsh way, gifted him. He laid Dusty gently in the ground, covering him with the soil. He marked the spot with a smooth gray river stone he'd kept on his bookshelf. No words were spoken, but the act itself was a final, heartfelt farewell. Back inside, the house felt cavernous, the silence unbearable. Dusty's water bowl sat empty. The cat tree stood unused. The indentation on the sofa cushion where he always slept seemed tragically vacant. Richard moved through the rooms like a ghost, the absence of his small companion a palpable presence. He sat on the porch as evening fell, the chair beside him empty. The desert sunset blazed, magnificent and indifferent. He thought about the storm that had brought Dusty, the quiet years that followed, the unexpected joy and companionship that had filled his lonely house. The sadness was immense, a heavy weight in his chest. But mingled with the grief was a profound sense of gratitude. Dusty had come into his life when he needed him most, breaking through the walls of solitude, offering warmth and affection without reservation. He had reminded Richard how to care, how to connect, how to love something fragile and alive. He didn't know how many sunsets he had left to watch. Age, he knew, was its own relentless storm. But as he sat there, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, he felt a quiet sense of peace settle over the sorrow. Dusty's life, though small in the grand scheme of things, had been significant. He had filled Richard's final years with meaning, with quiet joy, with love. And that, Richard understood, was a legacy as enduring as any bridge he had ever built. The silence was back, but it was different now, imbued with the echo of a purr, the memory of warmth, the enduring presence of a small desert cat named Dusty. He was alone again, but not entirely. The memory of their time together was a quiet light against the encroaching dark.